Just a moment, we'll be starting there. Just give us a second. Hello. Just give us one more minute. We'll be starting. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to Lunch Break with the Rabbi. Today we'll be talking about, as we usually do on Fridays, we do a review of the Torah reading of the week and its contemporary application and timeless lessons that we can all learn for all of us in every day and every age. Today, being Friday, the eve of Shabbat, today is also Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month of Elul, where today is already 30 days to the High Holy Days, and with that, today we begin to sound the shofar in preparation to inspire us and get us ready for those special days. It is also customary, a tradition that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, instituted, that starting from the first day of the month of Elul, we also add an additional 3 Psalms in Tehillim every single day, starting today 1 through 3, tomorrow 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so on. This way, when we come to Yom Kippur, we conclude the entire Psalms, which is also a very recommended and suggested noble idea, as this is a time that we increase in Torah, in prayer, and in charity. Also, as we are getting ready for the first Shabbos in the month of Elul, we remind ourselves of this connection and cultivation of this that we have during this month. As we mentioned yesterday, the king in the field, that this is an opportune time, especially on Shabbos, to reconnect with our source and reignite our soul. Now on to this week's Torah reading. This week's Torah reading is the 5th Torah reading of the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses continues his discussion and his last will and testament to the Jewish people. Moses in the previous Torah reading told us about the opportunities that the Jewish people are going to have when they come to the land of Israel, being that they're a land of opportunities, where then one can think of their independence. It is very tricky not to forget that we are dependent and reliant on God in all times, even when it seems that we are the motivator and the entrepreneur who brought about all the success that we have. In this week's Torah reading, Moses begins not only with the concepts of remembering the importance that God is always there in the actions that we do, but also in justice and in systems that are around us in order to continue to breed and bring about prosperity and faith in God. And he begins with the concept of appointing judges and policemen. The Talmud tells us that if we look at the contrast between the words that Moses uses before the Jewish people entered the land of Israel and the words that Isaiah uses concerning the time of the coming of Mashiach, we see a very similar but different wording. Moses says you will have judges and appoint policemen to enact the order of the judges, while Isaiah says you will have judges and advisors. Being that at the time of the coming of Mashiach, we do not have to concern ourselves about people not following the commandments. Therefore, Isaiah uses the terminology advisors. However, once the Jewish people come into the land of Israel, it's not enough for a judge to make a ruling, but there has to be somebody that's going to enforce it. Because a ruling can be made, but if there's nobody to enforce it, we know what it stands. But what does it mean to appoint judges? Why was this given specifically to the Jewish people? In fact, we know that one of the 7 Noahide laws are as well that a person has to have judges. And there's a different type of judgment or justice system that we could talk about. There's a justice system which every single person of humanity must observe. That means simple ethical and logical laws. But then there are also judges which the Torah enumerates over here, which Moses is alluding to, is that there is the concept of the interpretation of the oral law. As we know, throughout tradition in Judaism, when one would only read the written law, it would be very difficult for one to understand what is going on there. And it is only through the interpretation and the explanation of the rabbis throughout the generations that have the traditions back from Moses of what the interpretation in the oral law is. Only then do we truly understand and appreciate the oral law, the written law as well. And over here, Moses, what he's telling the Jewish people is that there are two types of judges that you have, similar to what you would call, you have a field and you have a garden. What's the difference between the field and the garden? A field is where you have your necessities, wheat, barley, and things of that nature. A garden is where you plant this beautiful fruit, which you can survive without, but it's great to have. The same idea is also justice is a system that every single person needs. In order for humanity to survive, we need to have a proper justice system. Then there are things above and beyond that, which is what Judaism is and what the rabbis within Judaic system of making the laws and enacting the laws were given by, which is the problem and the ability for them to interpret and to pass down the traditions that were given on Mount Sinai to Moses in understanding and appreciating the written law. Which brings us to the further where Moses discusses the concepts between the cities of refuge. We've mentioned this already a few weeks ago. There was a city of refuge. There were 3 cities of refuge in the land of Israel, 3 cities of refuge in the Jordan, which was on the other side of the Jordan. And over here, Moses alludes to the fact of the coming of Moshiach, that when the Jewish people's land will expand to take the other 3 nations as well, the Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni, which we are told will be in the time of the coming of Moshiach, then we will have to make another 3 cities of refuge as well. Over here, we see something a little different. The city of refuge was able to take any person that would come there. While when Moses says about putting judges and appointing judges and policemen, they had to be specific in every single location. And one of the reasons that Moses was alluding to was teaching the Jewish people that in order to judge another person, you cannot be on the outside and see what and how to judge that individual. You have to be there with them to see and appreciate what they're going through in order to judge them, which is a very important lesson for all of us. Very often we find ourselves judging people based on our circumstances of what we think or what we assume. And therefore we become to some type of assessment or judgment about that individual. As the Mishnah tells us in Ethics of Our Fathers, don't judge a person until you're in his shoes, or judge every person favorably. That every single time we look at somebody, automatically we judge them. There's no such thing as no judging. You wake up in the morning, you see the way a person's dressed, you're judging. If they had a shower, they didn't have a shower. You're always judging. The question is only, are we judging a person favorably? And also, are we judging them? Are we putting ourselves in their shoes, so to speak, to see where their circumstances, and maybe we would look at the angle a little differently. And therefore, as Moses tells the Jewish people, then when we see somebody, even a judge who's making a court case or has a scenario where they have to come to some type of ruling, they must be careful to see the facts the way they are for that individual, not from an outsider, so to speak, and say, well, you should have done that, you should have done this. The Torah then continues to tell us about the concept of testimony. And over here in an interesting law, where the Jewish law teaches us that 2 witnesses are the ones that are needed in order to adjudicate any type of testimony. There are 2 witnesses that are needed if you want to testify against any individual. Those 2 witnesses were then thoroughly researched to see that they are corroborating, as well as there are times that a person can self-admit to guilt. However, the only time we accept a person's self-admission to guilt is in financial matters. However, if it comes to matters between life and death, for example, if a person were to come along and say, I killed this individual, we will not believe him to give him the death penalty or whatever it is. Only through testimony of an outside witness can we rely on it. And the question is, what is the difference? Why is financial matters do I take a person's word for what it is? However, when it comes to matters of life, where a person says he went self-admission to guilt, shouldn't we believe him as well? And over here, the Torah explains to us, and Moses reminds the Jewish people of something of a very important and a paramount lesson that all of us need to remember, which is that we are not owners of our own body. It is for that reason that Judaism does not allow cremation. It is for that reason that you're not even allowed to tell somebody else to harm you. Self-harming is not allowed according to Judaism, because God gave us our body as a collateral. And the way we got it, we have to return it. We are not allowed to destroy it or hurt it. And therefore, the only reason why we were given our body was because we have a mission to accomplish in this world, is bringing light and holiness and spirituality in the world. And the only way we can accomplish it is if when our soul is fused in a body. So God allows us to use the body to be able to accomplish our task and mission in this world. After 120 years, when our body has accomplished its mission, our body goes back to the earth where it came from and untouched, unscathed, the way it should be. However, if a person comes along and a person says, I have killed A, B, and C, therefore he wants to harm himself by this way, so to speak, that he should be killed because of it, the Torah says absolutely not. You don't have that right. What's the difference when it comes to money? Isn't money also God's? Doesn't God give us money on loan? Yes. But the difference is that God gives us money and he tells us spend it. Use it wisely. Everything that we do in this world, everything we earn on a 90% commission. God says 10% you have to give to charity, 90% you can keep. And use as you wish. Now, a smart person will invest it wisely, spiritually, helping people for themselves and not whatever it may be. However, at the same time, God allows us, as long as we recognize that the money comes from God, then we can use it properly. So therefore, when it comes to a financial matter, we allow the admission of guilt because God allowed you to decide how you're going to use that money. However, when it comes to an admission of guilt concerning your own body, we cannot allow it to accept your own admission of guilt because you don't govern your body. Which brings us to the next step that Moses talks about, which is the concept of the Jewish people appointing a king. Now, all these mitzvahs that we talk about in this week's Torah reading, all of them are applicable at some level. And the question is how we find it applicable. So in this week's Torah reading, it tells us about the mitzvah that the Jewish people had to appoint a king upon themselves when they entered the land of Israel. The funny thing is that we find that when the Jewish people came into the land of Israel, and they finally got settled after fighting off all their enemies, they came to Samuel the prophet, and they asked Samuel the prophet, appoint upon us a king, as it says in the book of Deuteronomy. And Samuel the prophet rejects the notion, and he says, God says you have made me disgusted, which seemingly is not understood. If the Jewish people are told as a commandment in this week's Torah reading to appoint a king for themselves, and that is one of the basic positive commandments that are mentioned in the Torah, why would God be upset and call it disgusting? And the commentaries explain as follows. Because there are two types of kings. There's a king and there's a king. There's a king that you have that governs the people. And the entire purpose of the king is that he should be able to bring peace and justice amongst the people. They shouldn't be fighting with one another. For simple materialistic reasons, a king you need. There should be authority. But then there's another type of king. We know that the king on this world is similar to the king above. That when Jewish people see that there's a king, they can then have a better relationship with Almighty God. The king should be there to uplift them. As it says in the few weeks Torah reading we're going to read, that the king would get together in the Holy Temple and read from the Torah and inspire them to be better people, to be better connected to God. That's a king. And when the Jewish people came to Samuel and asked him, let us have a king like the rest of the nations, what kind of king were they looking for? They were looking for a king just for plain, simple, physical, authoritarian reasons. With that, God says, I'm disgusted. I thought you guys were better. I thought you were on a higher level. I would expect that you would ask for a king that help you, elevate you, and bring you to a level of conscious awareness of godliness. They say a story that when the Tsar was overthrown by the communists, there was a chassid who was weeping. So they asked him, why are you weeping? Why are you upset? Were you such a fan of the Tsar, especially at that time? They believed communism was the all-in-all answer to everything. He said, no, I'm not weeping because I missed the Tsar. He was an anti-Semite just like the communists. He did the Cantonists and he hurt us all. But I'm missing the parable of what it means to have a king. What it means to have an authority. What it means, because as it says, the kingdom on this world is like the kingdom above. I was able to better understand the teachings of mysticism when it spoke about a king and sovereignty when I saw a real king, a real czar. The Jewish people, when they asked Samuel for a king, they weren't looking for a king to become spiritually connected with God. They were looking for practical reasons, one that was going to wage war. Forgot about their dependency on God. God wants that every single one of us should appoint a king. Today also we can appoint a king. You have a rabbi. The Torah tells us, the Talmud says, who are the kings today? Those who study Torah. You can go to a rabbi and look at a rabbi and say, okay, he's a good for whatever I need and basic needs. I have a question, I ask the rabbi, whatever it may be. Or you can look to connect and ask the rabbi to be able to elevate and become connected closer to Judaism because of it. This is the job also of the rabbi and the king. Not only to merely answers to be a supplement to giving them things what they need physically, but even more so spiritually. But this brings us to the close of this week's Torah reading, and a very interesting but sad episode that the Torah talks about. That if God forbid we find a person murdered in between two cities, the two neighboring cities, the leaders of the closest cities, must come out and they kill a bull by the water, and they ask of God for mercy to forgive what happened to this individual who was killed, that we didn't properly take care of him. Make sure that he comes to safety. There are two parts to this mitzvah. Number one part is that Moshe was telling the Jewish people is that every single Jew is responsible for one another. That when if we, God forbid, find a Jew who is murdered spiritually, that unfortunately doesn't have any relationship or any connection to Judaism, we are all equally responsible to inspire them and to invigorate them. We have to know that we have a responsibility to every single Jew. We have to stand up and say, we cannot be the ones saying just wash our hands away and say, well, it's not my job, let a rabbi deal with it, whatever it may be. Every single Jew is responsible there for helping another Jew and educating them. If we know Aleph, we need to teach Aleph. You know Beis, you need to teach Beis. You knew somebody that can help and you can help them with their spiritual journey, go ahead. Help them out. Be there for them. Connect them. Physically and spiritually. How much more appropriate is this message, especially in this time that we're currently, where unfortunately there are many people who don't leave their homes because of the pandemic that's going on. There are many people who are stuck, whether it may be emotionally, in stress, spiritually, physically, confined. Over here, Moshe reminds the Jewish people, we have to be ready to stand up and say, our hands did not spill this blood. Ask for atonement for every single person, reminding every single one of us to be responsible for one another. We have to be there for each other, physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. Making sure that we can stand in front of God as it comes this new year of Rosh Hashanah and saying, Almighty God, we were there for our fellow Jew and our fellow man. Be here for us this year and inscribe us in the book of life. May we all be blessed with a good Shabbos, a healthy Shabbos, a wonderful year. Looking forward to celebrating with you in person, and the very best for a ksiva v'chasima tova be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. God bless you. See you on Monday at 1 p.m. All the best.